Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Mark My Brain. I know it's been a while, and I'm sorry for the delay between the uploads. However, it's 2026 and it's time to get back on track. So let us just jump into today's topic. Have you ever heard of or straight up experienced parents denying something that they did during their child's upbringing, potentially something that they did to the child that the child later found traumatic, perhaps? If the answer is yes, you're definitely not alone. There's basically an infinite number of online memes and jokes on this topic. And it's no surprise that it's been on my mind as well. So today I want to focus on this phenomenon, parents not remembering or straight up denying something that definitely did happen during, their child's childhood and upbringing, that the child usually finds traumatic or intense or it's a sad memory, and the parent just, doesn't remember it or denies it ever happening, or in some cases, misremembers it. Oh no, it happened a different way. That also happens. So I delved into this topic. I of course did some research, but before I reveal what I found out, I will just quickly tell you how I thought about the topic. Of course, I'm not an expert. I'm not educated in this area. I'm just, honestly interested in this topic because it is such a universal experience, and I've had talks with many of my friends exactly about this. So, how I thought about it is basically there can be many answers, but some of them that came to mind were, for example, they deny it or not remember it because they are avoiding accountability, some embarrassment or shame, Another answer can be that it's a form of narcissism or sort of a gaslighting tactic. And of course, the other answer can also be that they do remember it, but that they just straight up lie about it because, I don't know, they want to avoid conflict or sort of preserve their self-image. Which led me to another point that Nietzsche and Freud sort of talked about, and it's that repression of memories is sometimes a form of self-preservation. So that can also play a factor, right? So these were the things that immediately came to my mind when I started thinking about this topic as potential answers behind this behavior. However, let's not spend too much time on what I thought. Let's rather just look at what I found out when I did some actual research. So firstly, how true and how prevalent is this experience? And the key finding from my research is that this phenomenon is definitely real. Parents genuinely do forget or deny hurtful behaviors that children vividly remember, and it happens, as I mentioned, very universally. It doesn't matter from what background you came up, where do you live, where do your parents live, or what their background is. It is very, very widespread phenomenon. Okay, so we have that on the table. What about the reasons behind it? Why? Why does it happen? Why do they do this, right? The reason why isn't singular. I think there are many pieces of the puzzle, or rather I found out that there are many pieces of the puzzle, sort of many psychological mechanisms that can play a role. And the ones that we will touch on today are different memory encoding, spotlight effect in memory, motivated forgetting, that's a big one, shame-based denial, which sort of goes hand in hand with motivated forgetting, intergenerational trauma, certain cognitive limitations, as well as potential narcissistic elements. When I finished doing my research, I was sort of happy with myself because some of my initial ideas proved to be true, or at least in the correct direction. But of course, I didn't know too much about them. It was something that came to mind. Alright, so we'll take a look at them, at these mechanisms one by one, and we'll sort of try to put together some semi-coherent mosaic to answer the initial question. Why do parents not remember or straight up deny events from the past that their children find traumatic? Let's start with the first factor that I mentioned, different memory encoding. This one arises from one fundamental principle that we sort of have to keep in mind, and that is that memories are not some perfect recordings. They are only reconstructions that depend heavily on emotional significance at the time of encoding. So, that leads us to the idea that two parties of the conflict or trauma experience vastly different events, especially from the emotional point of view, like I mentioned, right? So for the children, the event is very or highly significant. They are, smaller, more vulnerable, and they depend on this person, the parent, for survival and security. The emotional intensity in that moment is high. The experience can be threatening, and so the memory itself becomes encoded as significant and personally very relevant. On the other hand, for the parent, the same event may feel like a routine disciplinary moment, a sort of unremarkable argument, or even simply justified behavior in that moment. If the parent wasn't stressed, emotionally dysregulated, or aware they were causing harm, the event didn't even register as emotionally significant to them. To them it may have been, quote, just another day, unquote. And, that's sort of one piece of the puzzle. Another insight that I found on this topic is that even generally speaking, research on autobiographical memory demonstrates that we prefer to remember events that feel sort of consequential to us. Events that are, unremarkable in the moment, even if they are emotionally traumatic to another person present, are less likely to be encoded into long-term memory. And here we have it. Different memory encoding stems from the fact that memories aren't perfect recordings, and the two parties remember or can remember the same event very differently, especially if we take into account the emotions of the moment and emotions of the two parties, right? Then we mentioned spotlight effect in memory. This one is sort of continuation of the previous point. Here, psychological research on parent-child relationships reveals that parents often have limited awareness of how their behavior affects children. And this is partly because parents may be focused on their own emotional state. That's the spotlight, focusing on their own emotional state. So, for example, their own stress, their tiredness or frustration, rather than, on their child's response. For example, a parent who yelled in anger might remember the context of their stress or anger, but not the tears in the child's eyes, basically. Or they might remember those tears as just an exaggerated reaction to a justified scolding, if you catch my meaning. Again, the same event is encoded differently with different details in different minds. What I found out during the research is that children often remember facial expressions and tone, and how small or unsafe they felt, the specific words used, and of course the emotional aftermath. However, parents often remember, or more often remember, what the child did wrong from their perspective, their own justification for the response, their own emotional state, and very little about a child's actual reaction. These aren't false memories, they're just genuinely different memories of the same event. Going back to that fundamental principle of memories being only reconstructions of past events, not perfect recordings. That's spotlight effect in memory, focusing on my own emotional state and well-being rather than what I'm causing to the other person and how my behavior is affecting them, right? All right, let's move on. Next point, motivated forgetting, is a very interesting one. This is a different psychological mechanism that can play a major role here. It is sort of the brain's adaptive capacity to unconsciously suppress memories that threaten self-image or that trigger intolerable emotional states. What does it mean? When parents behave harshly towards their children, they are faced with sort of a psychological threat. Their core identity is often based on being, quote, a good parent or, quote, a good person, unquote. And acknowledging harsh, unkind, or damaging behavior sort of contradicts this core identity, you know? So that's the threat to the self-image I was talking about. And when we take a closer look at the three possible drivers behind motivated forgetting, or the three that I found are the most prevalent, at first place is shame avoidance. Because shame can be an extremely powerful motivator. It's a very deep, painful emotion that can, again, attack the core sense of self. Shame basically says, I am bad. There's nothing more to it. Not I behaved badly, shame says, I am bad. And in order to avoid feeling shame, brain can activate motivated forgetting, the process of motivated forgetting. The memory that causes shame becomes less accessible, details fade, and the event is sort of reinterpreted. The sort of the rationalization that it wasn't that bad, or it didn't happen that way, it happened slightly differently. And this shift sort of accumulates after time. It's sort of a protective unconscious mechanism, I would say. So that's shame avoidance, one driver behind motivated forgetting. Another one is self-image protection. It can be sort of a psychological confirmation bias, or that's how I choose to think about it. Humans are motivated to remember information that supports their self-image and forget information that contradicts it. So parent that sees themselves and likes to think about themselves as patient or kind will tend to remember instances confirming this, while forgetting or reframing instances of impatience or cruelty. Again, the things that contradict the sense of self or the self-image. All right, so that's self-image protection. And third driver behind motivated forgetting can be maintaining or maintenance of critical relationships. Because findings in trauma research is that people sometimes forget or minimize abuse from caregivers, specifically because they depend on them. But this can go both ways, because the relationship between parents and their child is of course very important to the parents as well. So they might also be motivated to suppress certain memories to maintain the relationship in some sort of working way. And of course, the self-image as well. So these are the three key drivers I found when doing research on motivated forgetting. It's shame avoidance, self-image protection, and maintaining of critical relationships. And I would guess that these drivers usually mix. There typically won't be just one, because even from just describing them briefly like this, it seems to me they must be sort of interconnected. And one point I would like to add to motivated forgetting is that whatever the subconscious driver behind motivated forgetting might be, it's important to remember that it isn't lying. Even though the result or outcome can look identical from the outside perspective, these processes just happen very deep in the subconscious. They are sort of encoded into our psyche. And one has to, I guess, work very consciously to control them, I would say. All right, that was motivated forgetting, another sort of piece of the puzzle. Let's move on to intergenerational trauma. Of course, it plays a role. Of course, who would have guessed, right? So it's another piece of the mosaic, sort of. Crucial finding in trauma research says that parents who themselves experienced childhood trauma are more likely to show denial and lack of memory about harming their own children. Isn't that interesting? And this can happen for several reasons. Firstly, unresolved trauma impairs self-awareness. Parents with their own unresolved trauma have difficulty with accessing their own emotional states, and understanding their triggers and reflecting on their behavior. So this all makes it hard to form clear memories of certain interactions. Secondly, identification with the aggressor. Some parents, and I say some parents unconsciously minimize or reinterpret their own harsh behavior because they're unconsciously identifying with their own parents. They may genuinely not see their behavior as harsh because they're viewing it through their parents' framework. So, as justified, right? Or as right. Right behavior. Thirdly, emotional numbing. Trauma can produce dissociation and emotional numbing, which reduces the emotional encoding of events, making them less memorable, right? Going back to the very first point we were making about different memory encoding, if the parent lived through some trauma which produced this dissociation and numbed them emotionally, it will be harder for them to make the memories more memorable. And last but not least, when it comes to intergenerational trauma, the reason why it affects this behavior as well is the sort of intergenerational transmission. Parents who were never validated about their own childhood harm may have no model for acknowledging and taking responsibility for the harm they themselves cause. The only model they witnessed was just denial and minimization. So, of course, that's what goes round and round again until someone consciously stops it. Again, these reasons seem to be at least somewhat interconnected, so I would bet that there will be probably a mixture of them in most cases as well. And one interesting note I want to add to intergenerational trauma is that the research on this type of trauma shows that healing can interrupt this cycle, but it requires parents to access their own trauma and process it, which, as you might also know, is something that many are unwilling or unable to do. Moving on to next point. I mentioned also certain cognitive limitations can play a role, and that's true. Another factor that emerges from research on parenting cognition is that parents with lower working memory capacity are more likely to engage in harsh discipline without consciously remembering or processing how harsh they are actually being. And what is this working memory? It's sort of the mental workspace we use for conscious attention and reflection. If you're someone who understands computers, you might basically think about it as RAM memory, right? Is the mental workspace we use for conscious attention and reflection. And what research suggests is that parents with lower working memory capacity typically find it harder to regulate emotions when they are stressed, are more likely to react with anger rather than pause and reflect, have less capacity to consider their child's perspective in the moment, and later struggle to reconstruct what happened with accurate detail. It can play out as when a parent yells at a child in a moment of low working memory capacity, often during stress. They may not be encoding the interaction with full consciousness. So later, when asked about it, they genuinely struggle to remember because it was never fully processed in the first place. And of course, this is compounded by stress, poverty, and unsurprisingly, trauma in the parent's own life. That's cognitive limitations or lower working memory capacity. And last point, or last key factor behind this whole question and parents denying some traumatic memories from child's upbringing are, potential narcissistic elements. We have to talk about it because all that we talked about until now was very much out of control of the parents, something deep, unconscious, some psychological mechanisms that just happen naturally. Of course, I mentioned that, for example, therapy or dealing with their own trauma can help in these cases, but they are still, psychologically encoded. Something that the parent definitely has control over is, their narcissistic behavior. I want to mention that all the previous points that we talked about can, according to research, explain vast majority of all cases. So the narcissism will play a role in a very small minority of cases. However, of course, the topic wouldn't be complete without mentioning of them, because they can also play a role, and in contrast to previous points, they are conscious. So what am I talking about? Some parents do seem to engage in more deliberate or conscious denial, which can indicate narcissistic traits. And signs that this is happening or that the behavior goes beyond normal motivated forgetting, for example, can be pattern of blame shifting, always blaming the child for remembering wrong or being too sensitive. Secondly, lack of any empathy. Zero capacity to imagine how their behavior affected the child, even hypothetically. Thirdly, grandiosity about parenting. These types of parents often claim to have been a perfect parent or always acted in your best interest, right? Fourth point, rage at being questioned. Disproportionate anger at any suggestion that caused harm. They will just straight up get angry when you try to tell them. And lastly, last sign that the narcissism can play a role here is deliberate gaslighting, intentionally contradicting the child's account to make them doubt themselves. I think this goes without explanation. And these patterns suggest something beyond memory differences. They suggest a sort of defensive structure built on narcissistic defenses rather than simply motivated forgetting. So that was a quick mention of also narcissistic elements which can play a role. Alright, so we went through all of these different reasons or potential reasons that can play a role in answering our questions or question. Why do parents not remember or straight up deny events from the past that their children find traumatic, something that they did? We went over different memory encoding, spotlight effect, motivated forgetting, shame-based denial, intergenerational trauma, certain cognitive limitations, as well as the narcissistic elements. So what are the final points? What can we sort of extract from this whole episode? This whole research offers several insights, I would say. First one is that your memory is probably accurate about the emotional reality. And it's very, very important to remember. The event likely did happen roughly as you remember it, and it likely did impact you as you remember. parents or anyone's, for that matter, lack of memory doesn't invalidate your experience. Second point is parents' denial is usually not conscious malice. Also something I view as important to remember. Understanding the mechanisms we talked about, the motivated forgetting, shame avoidance, differential encoding, can help us sort of reframe the parent's response as protective rather than purely hostile. Though, of course, this doesn't excuse the harm itself, but can offer a different perspective. Third point I want to take away from all this is that confronting parents rarely produces acknowledgement. Because the denial is partly motivated and partly rooted in genuine memory gaps, confronting a parent is unfortunately unlikely to produce the validation many adult children seek. The parent may just move on from I don't remember to that's not how I remember it, or even if that happened, it wasn't that bad. Again, sort of reinterpretation what really happened because they have memory gaps, they subconsciously decided to forget, stuff like that. So, for those of you that might be waiting for that validation, it's possible that it will never come, or at least it will never come in the form that you expected. And fourth and final point I want to mention is that healing doesn't require parental acknowledgement. Again, sort of separating ourselves from what might have happened, from the potential trauma, from our parents' behavior. Therapeutic work can help adult children process childhood trauma without needing the parent to validate the memory. The validation can come from a therapist, support group, or just trusted others, your friends, for example, who can understand the trauma dynamics, and this can sort of at least kickstart the healing process, even if the parents don't acknowledge it, for example, don't acknowledge the trauma. All right, so these are the 4 final points I want you to take away from this episode. Your memory is probably accurate about the emotional reality. Parents' denial is usually not conscious malice. Confronting parents rarely produces acknowledgement, and healing doesn't require parental acknowledgement. However, I also want to mention something that can be useful for parents listening this, or soon-to-be parents, for parents wanting to understand. If a parent is listening to this and recognizes themselves in the pattern of not remembering harm they caused, research suggests several steps to consider. Firstly, acknowledge that the lack of memory is real and not necessarily lying, because you may genuinely not remember the incident the way your child does. And this doesn't mean it didn't happen as they experience it. Secondly, explore your own shame. As we heard, part of the reason why you might be subconsciously motivated to forget is shame, avoiding shame. So if hearing about the harm you caused triggers defensiveness, anger, or immediate denial, sort of notice the response, because shame often hides beneath those reactions, and it's sort of emotionally mature, I would argue, to explore that. Thirdly, ask questions instead of defending. Rather than, going straight up to that never happened, try, tell me what you remember. I want to understand how that affected you. This validates the child's experience while, being honest about memory differences. You are curious, you might not remember it, but you try, you ask and you validate the child's experience. Fourth, consider your own childhood. How were you parented? What was normalized for you? Understanding, again, your upbringing can help you illuminate why certain parenting behaviors felt normal to you, but were actually harmful to your child. Again, intergenerational trauma, something I also mentioned during the episode. And of course, the fifth point is, if you're really invested in this, seek therapy if possible. A trauma-informed therapist can help you process your own experiences and develop capacity for accountability without destroying your self-image. Because of course, that's something we want to avoid at all costs. So, yeah, these points, I would say, are relevant not just for current parents, but also, for example, for us, younger generation, to remember when we will have our own children. Let's try to minimize the negative impact we might have on them by actively working on ourselves and our own emotional intelligence. I view that as sort of a responsibility to the future generations and our children. So those are my final points, and I think that about brings us to the end of the episode. It was a very interesting topic, at least for me, to delve into, so I hope you also get something from this, you learn something. If you have any interesting insights, definitely feel free to share, I'm interested, and take care of yourselves. Until next time, bye.